Salvete omnes! In this lesson, we will learn about infinitives and indirect statements in Latin. Before watching this video, please read pages 120 through 126 in your textbook. This lesson will cover the following topics: an overview of the infinitive mood, how to form the present, perfect, and future active infinitives, and how to recognize, construct, and translate indirect statements in Latin. Latin has four moods, one of which is the infinitive. Unlike the other moods, which have relatively easy uses to describe, the infinitive mood has many special but disparate uses. We already know one. Some verbs, such as possum, require a complementary infinitive to complete their semantics. Another way the infinitive isn't like the other moods is that its morphology does not indicate its subject the way verbs in other moods do. Infinitives require their subjects to be expressed elsewhere in the sentence. Infinitives have voice, either active or passive, but we only know the active voice, so don't worry about the passive for now. And finally, the infinitive only has three tenses: the present, perfect, and future. Let's take a look at how to form each tense of the infinitive and the active voice. Thankfully, these processes are the same for all 5 conjugations of verbs, so we will use amo, amare, amavi, amatum as our example. You already know how to form the present active infinitive. It is just the second principal part of any given verb and is generally translated as to verb. So the present active infinitive of amo would be amare, which is generally translated as to love. The perfect active infinitive, as you might expect, is derived from the third principal part, with the addition of the suffix sse added. So the perfect active infinitive of amo would be amavisse, which is generally translated as to have loved. The future active infinitive is a little bit tricky because it requires a periphrastic construction. This means that it requires more than one word. In this case, it is formed by taking the fourth principal part, removing the ending, adding ur, and whatever first or second declension ending is required by the subject, as well as esse. So the future active infinitive of amo would be amaturum esse, which is generally translated as about to love. Now that we have learned how to form present, perfect, and future active infinitives, let's learn about the most important and common use of the infinitive, indirect statement. Before we do that, however, let's make sure that we know the difference between direct and indirect speech. Take the first sentence. Ashley said, "I cleaned my room." This is an example of direct speech. It uses quotation marks and reports the exact words that were spoken. Now take a look at the other sentence. Ashley said that she cleaned her room. This is an example of indirect speech. Indirect speech does not use quotation marks and often doesn't report the exact words that were spoken. Additionally, indirect speech in English is sometimes introduced by the word that. So what do indirect statements look like in Latin? Indirect statements in Latin are introduced by what I like to call head verbs. These are verbs of speaking, thinking, perceiving, or basically any action that can be performed by the head. These include dico, audio, sentio, video, and voco. Anytime you see a head verb, you should expect an indirect statement, which has its subject in the accusative and its verb in the infinitive. So, dicit puellam laetam esse would translate to, he says that the girl is happy. Our head verb is dicit, our accusative subject is puellam, and our verb is esse. Although this sentence is short and simple, know that indirect statements are no different from any other clause and may contain modifiers, objects, and prepositional phrases. One last thing to cover before we end this video. Dickey makes a big deal about tense of the infinitive in indirect statement. However, this only makes sense if you are a very precise speaker of English, which most people, including myself, are not. What I want you to take away from that section of the textbook and this section of the video is that the tense of the infinitive in indirect statement is relative to the tense of the main verb. Take these 3 exempla, which only differ with respect to the tense of the infinitive in the indirect statement. In the first exemplum, the infinitive in the indirect statement is amare, which is present, and thus contemporaneous with the main verb, which is perfect. So, dixit illum te amare would translate in law-abiding standard English to, she said that man loved you. In colloquial English, you might translate this sentence instead as, she said that man loves you. Compare with the second exemplum. Here our infinitive is amawisse, which is perfect and thus expresses action that happened prior to the main verb. So dixit illum te amawisse would translate in law-abiding standard English to, she said that man had loved you. In colloquial English, you might translate this sentence as, she said that man loved you. Finally, let's take a look at the third exemplum. Here our infinitive is amaturum esse, which is future and thus expresses action that will happen after the main verb. So dixit illum te amaturum esse would translate in law-abiding standard English as, she said that man would love you. In colloquial English instead, you might translate this sentence as, she said that man will love you. In general, if you come across an indirect statement, just translate the tenses of the main verb and the infinitive as they are, and you will be just fine. Hooray! I know I say this in every video, but indirect statement is an incredibly common and important construction in Latin, so be sure to internalize this information the best you can. Remember, if you see a head verb, you should expect an accusative, an infinitive, and indirect statement to follow. With that said, waleta!